Israel has reacted to condemnation of its killing of 2 journalists in the Gaza Strip by accusing one of them of being a Hamas sniper. Now, Israel, on a regular basis, accuses Al Jazeera media of working with militant groups. The media group Al Jazeera denies any involvement. Hussam Shabat was one of the best-known journalists in Gaza. Gaza's civil defense agency said that Shabat was killed when an Israeli drone struck his car on Monday afternoon near a petrol station in the northern town of Beit Lahiya. The other journalist who was killed was Mohammed Mansour, who worked for a media which is described as pro-Islamic jihad called Palestine Today. Now, Israel says, without providing proof, that Shabat was a sniper terrorist from the Beit Hanun battalion of the Hamas terrorist organization, who was also employed as journalist by Al Jazeera. That's how it's stated on paper. Let's bring in Jodie Ginsberg, who's on the Committee to Protect Journalists. Jodie, a very good evening to you. 2 colleagues killed covering a war. This is not a good sign for freedom of speech, and certainly not a good sign that the truth will be coming out about what's happening.
No, it's not. And these 2 killings bring to 173 the number of journalists and media workers that we have documented at the Committee to Protect Journalists as having been killed since the start of the Gaza war. Last year was the deadliest year for journalists worldwide that CPJ has ever documented, and 2/3 of those killings were carried out by Israel.
And the thing is that freedom of speech also suffers in times of war because if journalists can't go into places and bring back the story, the public won't find out what's going on. Is there, though, an interest here to target journalists to prevent the story getting out?
Well, it's the old adage, isn't it, that truth is the first casualty in war. And certainly what we have seen over the past year and a half is a systematic attempt to control the information coming out of Gaza. Remember, no foreign journalists have been allowed into Gaza to report on what's happening, except on very strictly controlled trips controlled by the Israeli army. So we are entirely reliant on Palestinian journalists for information about what's happening inside of Gaza. So in addition to the killings that we've seen a pattern where we think there are at least 14 targeted deliberate killings of journalists, but we've seen the killings of journalists, we've seen the arrest of journalists at record levels for Israel, we've seen the targeting of infrastructure, media infrastructure, and of course the censoring of news outlets, including Al Jazeera in Israel, but also the Israeli news outlet Haaretz, where the government said that it would remove government advertising for its stance on the war. So that's all part of a pattern that we see in which Israel deliberately tries to control information coming out about the war.
Indeed, I can back up completely what you're saying, Jodie, about trying to get into Gaza. I was there end of January, beginning of February on a 2-week assignment, and getting into the Gaza Strip was just an impossible task to try to attempt because of the fact you pointed out that Israel has closed all access. That's being controlled very, very, very strictly by Israel in that sense. And of course, then trying to tell the story becomes more and more difficult, all the while with this sense that you are under threat. What would you call for from the authorities, from the people who can change things to protect journalists? I mean, clearly this is a situation where you have one side perhaps trying to stop the truth getting out, and those who are trying to expose that will automatically be at risk.
So first and foremost, we would call on Israel to stop targeting of journalists. The deliberate targeting of any civilian, and journalists are considered civilians in a war, is considered a war crime. So immediately to prevent that, we would strongly urge and continue to urge Israel to allow foreign media into Gaza to be able to report on what's happening inside Gaza, and to cease the censorship of news outlets from Israel and writing about Gaza. Those are the things that can be done immediately to improve the situation. And of course, to stop smearing without credible evidence those journalists who continue to report. One of the things that we've seen repeatedly during this war, but in the preceding 2 decades, is Israel frequently smearing journalists as terrorists, most frequently after those journalists have been killed, but in the case, for example, of Hussam Shabat, in advance of his killing, and yet producing no credible evidence to suggest that those individuals were terrorists. And of course, that sows doubt in the mind of the public about whether or not those individuals are trustworthy.
It's worth repeating, just in case people didn't catch that, no proof that Shabat, Mr. Shabat, was a Hamas sniper, as Israel's claiming.
We've seen no credible evidence that Mr. Shabat is a terrorist, was a terrorist. And this is not an isolated case. We've seen this repeatedly in the cases of journalists who have been killed, and subsequently Israel alleging that they were considered terrorists, but providing absolutely no credible evidence. And Israel has never been held accountable for the killing of any journalist for the past 24 years.
Jodie Ginsberg of the Committee to Protect Journalists, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24 and giving us your insight and analysis on what is an increasingly important